we go. And we'll be able to share a link to the recording with you afterwards, as well as for any of your colleagues who might have missed it. We do have Spanish and Portuguese interpretation available. You can go to the interpretation button. It's a little glow at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we also invite your comments and questions. Down near the interpretation button, you can find a Q&A box. So please submit any questions that you have there, and we'll answer them at the end. Or if it's a very sort of technical basic question, then we can answer it in writing as well. And please also feel free to use the chat. But if you have any questions, do pop them in the Q&A box. And if you think of the question for the speakers at any point, just put it in and we'll collate them all at the end. So on to today's speakers. So we're going to start up with Micah from BankTrack, who will be presenting the Banking on Climate Chaos report. Then we'll have Nemo, who will be speaking about the impacts of oil drilling on communities, especially women and families in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Ilan from 350 America Latina will then give an overview of their campaigns in Latin America, followed by Pendle from Amazon Watch, who will be speaking about the Amazon exclusion campaign. Then we'll have Chief Jonas Miura, who will speak about the impacts of oil and gas extraction in his territory in the Brazilian Amazon. And finally, Chief Jorge Nahuel, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but has sent a video about the impacts of fracking in Vaca Muerta, so that you can still hear from him. So to get things started, I'll hand over to my colleague Micah, who will be presenting the findings of the recent Banking on Climate Chaos report with you all.
Yes, thank you, Natasha. And I'm hoping that you can see my screen now. Is that right? Yeah, thanks. Okay, so hello everyone, good evening. So as Natasha introduced, my name is Micah. I'm the campaign lead for Banks and Climate at BankTrack. BankTrack is a small organization based in the Netherlands, and we focus on commercial banks and the projects and companies that they finance that have often adverse impact on human rights, climate, or nature. BankTrack is one of the organizations that every year publishes the Banking on Climate Chaos report. We do this together with the Rainforest Action Network, Indigenous Environmental Network, Oil Change International, Reclaim Finance, Sierra Club, and Urgewald. So today I'll be presenting the findings of our most recent report that we published in March of this year, with a bit of a focus, of course, on sort of the Latin America aspect of the report. So the scope of the report, I should be clicking here. Yes, so what we look at with the Banking on Climate Chaos report is commercial banks. So that means not like state-owned banks or multilateral development banks, but commercial banks like JP Morgan Chase is, I think, a very famous one. We look at the 60 largest banks globally and their financing to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement, so over a period of 2016 until 2021. We look at their financing for the fossil fuel industry as a whole, but also at specific high impact subsectors like fracking, for example. And we also look at their financing for companies that are expanding the fossil fuel industry. And then finally, we also assess the policies that they have to already restrict the financing decisions that they make. And we also look at a number of case studies. So I'll sort of touch upon all of these aspects of the report now. So first, looking at the financial research that we do. I guess this is maybe the most boring slide of my presentation. It's a bit of a methodological note, just so you're sort of clear on what we look at and also what we don't look at. So a first important thing is that we look at the financing a bank provides to a company, and then we calculate the percentage of that based on how much of the company is active in fossil fuels. So if, for example, a bank gives a loan of $100 to a company that is 50% active in fossil fuels and for 50% in solar panels, then our report would show the loan for $50. So that's important to take into account because it means that the finance numbers that we give are actually a smaller amount than what the banks have actually provided, but we sort of size it to the portion of the companies that are active in fossil fuels. For the high impact subsectors, we also don't look at all of the companies active in, for example, fracking, but we look at the top 30 companies active in those subsectors. And for the expansion category, we have a list of top 100 companies. I think the most important conclusion to take from sort of this methodological note is always that really the finance data that we provide is like the tip of the iceberg. I think, in fact, the amount of financing being provided will be larger than what we say, but you know, it gives quite a robust overview. So then, what did we actually find? So our most recent report showed that in the 6 years since the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks provided $4.6 trillion in financing to the fossil fuel industry. 4.6 trillion is a really massive amount of money that to me doesn't mean so much. But I think it's important to most of all note that this is not decreasing. So of course, in the Paris Agreement, the world sort of agreed that we would limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees, which means phasing out the use of fossil fuels. And that should also mean phasing out financing for fossil fuel companies. But we don't really see a decrease in this financing year by year. Then who are the banks that are actually providing that financing? This is a list of the top 12 banks coming out of our research. And the largest banks every year are the big American ones. So JP Morgan Chase always leads the list. Citi is a really big one. There's also a few Canadian banks in the top 12, so Royal Bank of Canada. And then, for example, from Japan, Mizuho and MUFG. And from Europe, the largest financiers are Barclays and BNP Paribas. Then we also looked at which banks had sort of the biggest increase in financing from 2020 to 2021, because as I said before, we should really be seeing a decrease in the financing being provided. But these banks listed here have actually increased their financing since the previous years. So here again, we see Wells Fargo right at the top there. And as a Dutch organization, we were not very happy to see ING in the list here. But I think it's sort of most notable here that we see a lot of the same names in this big increase that are also in sort of the top 12 overall. So it's really sort of the same banks we see every time that are providing the most financing. Then, of course, today we're talking about Latin America. A note here maybe is that a lot of some banks active in Latin America are outside of the scope of our report because they're not among the 60 largest commercial banks. But some of the banks that are in our report are also active in the region. And I think most notable are Santander, BBVA, and CaixaBank. So what we saw is that Santander is the largest of the three. They have provided almost 43 billion in financing to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement. BBVA follows a bit, and then CaixaBank is a bit smaller. And what you see at the top here is a bit of a trend line. And I think most notable is that Santander has really seen a big spike, especially around 2020. So of course, that's also again sort of against the trend that we should be seeing. So to move over to the subsectors that I already mentioned, the report also looks at financing for specific high impact subsectors. That includes tar sands, fracking, Arctic oil and gas, coal mining, coal power. And we do this because these are sectors that have sort of an additional impact on environment and human rights. So we really want to highlight the financing that is provided to these sectors. And so I won't go into the details like which banks are exactly financing which subsector. If there's any questions around that, I can maybe answer them separately. But maybe interesting to note that there are some sort of trends. So for example, when it comes to tar sands, we really see the Canadian banks that are always in the top financing that sector, which is not strange because a lot of tar sands, of course, is being extracted in Canada. And then for coal mining and coal power, it's a lot of Chinese banks still financing that. that is also related to the fact that a lot of banks elsewhere have been adopting policies restricting financing for coal for a longer time. And as I mentioned before, sort of the overall top is always the US banks that are providing really the most financing. So this is a big table, but I really wanted to focus a bit on the expansion top financiers, because what I mentioned is that we really focus on expansion because, as we all know, the developed reserves of fossil fuels will already blow our carbon budget beyond 1.5 degrees of global warming. So really there cannot be any further expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And we see that some banks are sort of taking this on board. So for example, after the IEA came with the conclusion that there can be no further investments in new fossil fuels, Dutch bank ING and also Santander have introduced new restrictions for financing upstream oil and gas projects. But still, research by Urgewald, which is also a report partner, has shown that over 80% of oil and gas companies still have plans to expand fossil fuel production. So these banks that are still financing fossil fuel expansion are really sort of going against all of the scientific evidence. And I think here to note for the Spanish bench that I mentioned earlier, Santander is really sort of on the trend line of like quite a flat trend line, and BBVA has seen a bit of an increase. So for fracking, maybe interesting to mention, because of course we'll also be talking about Vaca Muerta today. BBVA and Santander are also quite high. They are ranked 26th and 29th in terms of financing for the fracking sector. And especially Santander has financed companies that are also active in Vaca Muerta, like BP, Equinor, and Shell. And I also wanted to highlight this, the company Petrobras, because it is both a company that is actively expanding the extraction of fossil fuels. They're active in fracking, offshore oil and gas, ultra deep water. They have production in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and the USA, but they are also still exploring for new oil and gas, also in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Colombia, for example. So this is really an example of the type of company that is expanding also in these controversial sectors, and that we are really looking for banks to no longer finance. So as I mentioned, the research also looks at the policies that banks have to restrict financing for the fossil fuels. Here again, I won't go into all the details because that would take up a bit too much time, but just to explain that we look separately at coal and oil and gas, and then also again those unconventional subsectors. And a bit of a trend here again is that policies around coal tend to be a bit stronger than around oil and gas. But overall, you know, we really see policies are not strong enough. There has been sort of on oil and gas a new best practice being set last year by the French bank La Banque Postale, who decided to exclude financing for companies that expand fossil fuels. So that was really an important step. But overall, we see that only 5 banks globally explicitly mention companies with expansion plans. So that means that 55 of the banks researched have no policy that limits their financing to companies expanding production. And then 38 banks restrict financing to oil and gas projects, but a lot less restrict financing to companies overall. So we see you know, some movement like this, but overall the quality of the policies is really lacking. And when it comes to the banks I mentioned before, BBVA, Caixa, and Santander, BBVA has a policy to exclude dedicated upstream oil and gas for Arctic and tar sands, but they have no policy to limit financing for companies expanding fossil fuels, and also no policy to phase out fossil fuel financing overall. And Santander recently adopted a new fossil fuel policy that has seen a good sort of improvement. They now exclude the provision of financial services for upstream oil projects. Also, the same also goes for Arctic oil and gas, shale oil and gas, tar sands, and coal bed methane. So these are again some really good improvements, but again, this does not apply to excluding companies overall, but really sort of upstream projects. If you're really interested in knowing a lot more about the details of policies, then I've put here at the bottom the coal policy tool and the oil and gas policy tracker. These are tools developed by partner Reclaim Finance, where you can see sort of all of the details of specific bank policies. So that's a really good resource. And I wanted to briefly highlight some common loopholes. I've made a list here, I won't go into all of them. Some common loopholes that we see in the policies of financial institutions. And I think the first one I've already mentioned a bit is that happens often banks exclude financing, for example, for fracking projects, but then they do not exclude financing for the companies doing those projects. So that is a bit of a loophole. Because only about 5% of financing being provided is actually project finance, and around 90% is actually corporate finance. Another example is where companies sort of ignore conventional oil and gas. So they might have a policy that limits financing for sectors that get a lot of media attention, like Arctic oil and gas, but they do not address at all just conventional oil and gas extraction. And then another sort of hip topic I wanted to touch upon is the net zero commitments versus the actual fossil fuel policies. What we've seen a lot over the last year is banks joining the Net Zero Banking Alliance or otherwise making commitments to zero out their what we call financed emissions. So they promise that by 2050, the emissions that they have financed, so basically the emissions of the companies that have provided financing for, will be net zero by 2050. But this often results into sort of long-term phase-out plans and not a lot of concrete commitments. Whereas, of course, what we already know that needs to be done is that they need to stop financing companies and projects active in fossil fuel extraction. Here's just an example of this. The British bank Barclays joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance in 2021. So they promised to zero out their financed emissions by 2050. But then over that year, they were still part of a 6 billion loan to Equinor, which we saw was active in Vaca Muerta, a 10 billion loan to ExxonMobil, a 2.4 billion loan to BP, and then 1.5 billion loan to Shell. So all of this new financing happening right after that they promised to zero out their financed emission. So this is really something for campaigners to pay a lot of attention to, that commitments by banks on the one hand that may sound very nice, but that do not translate directly into actual reducing of fossil fuel finance, we should be wary of. And then my final point before we go to the next speaker is the report also includes or links to a lot of case studies. Here's just a map of cases that we have highlighted, and we do this because what we really hope is also that the report sort of contributes to the campaigns and the fights of local communities that are opposing specific oil and gas and coal extraction. So we really also try to highlight those stories and those fights, and we hope to contribute to increased attention to those fights in general media. But also to bring those to the attention of banks. So we're no longer talking about sort of the 4.6 trillion that I mentioned at the beginning, which is of course a very abstract number, but really what does it mean on the ground and where is that oil and gas being extracted? So one of the case studies we highlighted this year is something we'll hear more about today. Of course, is oil and gas extraction in the Amazon. So I think that's a good bridge, and I'll hand it back to Natasha.
Thanks very much, Micah. And if you have any questions for Micah, you can pop them in the Q&A box. And if you have any thoughts, then feel free to pop them in the chat. So I'm now going to hand over to Nemo, who's going to talk about the impacts of oil drilling in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So Nemo, and for anyone who is listening in English, you can go into the interpretation.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Nemo. Soy de la nacionalidad guaraní. Represento a la Confeniai. Confeniai es una organización que representa a 11 nacionalidades y 23 organizaciones en la región amazónica. Actualmente en la Amazonía de Ecuador nosotros estamos viviendo momentos muy críticos porque ha hecho nuevos decretos para ampliar la frontera petrolera en Ecuador. Entonces, con eso quiere decir que van a empezar a explorar, ¿no?, en nuestros territorios que aún están siendo vírgenes. Tenemos bosques limpios, agua limpia, montaña limpios y quieren destruir para entrar a nuestros territorios. Actualmente nosotros como pueblos indígenas a nivel de todo Ecuador hemos convocado para poder detener un poco la situación que está sucediendo. Es muy duro estos momentos que está sucediendo. Estamos en un paro a nivel nacional para que el gobierno de Ecuador nos dé espacio para conversar, nos dé espacio de diálogo a los pueblos indígenas para llegar a tener un diálogo que no permita más destrucción en nuestros territorios. No queremos más destrucción para nuestros territorios, no queremos más contaminación. Queremos un territorio limpio. Actualmente la CONAIE ha convocado a una marcha, a un paro indefinido en Ecuador por temas, no por 10 puntos que estamos tratando actualmente. Uno de ellos es no más ingreso de petroleras en nuestros territorios y no más ingreso de minerías que están en nuestros territorios también, invadiendo y saqueando nuestras riquezas y contaminando en nuestros territorios. Para nosotros, a nombre del desarrollo, han hecho mucho daño a nuestro territorio. Nuestro territorio lo único que ha quedado es contaminación, pobreza, enfermedades y muertes. Nosotros no queremos más, queremos vivir en nuestro territorio limpio, queremos vivir en nuestro territorio con nuestros animales, con nuestros bosques limpios. No más destrucción, ya no queremos, nos está matando también a nuestros hermanos Taromenani, que está haciendo, ellos viven sin el contacto con el mundo exterior, porque ellos no quieren tener ni un contacto, porque quieren vivir en su hábitat también libres y la ampliación de las empresas petroleras está afectando el espacio de vida de los hermanos Taromenani. También está afectando el espacio de vida de nosotros que estamos viviendo en las comunidades. También está afectando el espacio de vida de los animales. Está reduciendo con la llegada de las empresas petroleras, está reduciendo nuestro espacio de vida. Ya no hay mucho más que seguir permitiendo que sigan ingresando, a pesar de la lucha de los pueblos indígenas, ha sido conjunta, pero las grandes empresas con el gobierno se alian, siguen ingresando cada día destruyen miles de árboles en nuestros territorios, siguen haciendo carreteras, siguen destruyendo nuestros ríos. No hay espacio, ya nosotros los pueblos indígenas estamos cansados, queremos vivir en paz, queremos tener nuestros territorios libres, ya no más contaminación. Queremos que pare esta situación. Por eso nosotros también hacemos vocería a nivel nacional, a nivel internacional, para que los líderes a nivel mundial vean lo que está sucediendo en la Amazonía de Ecuador, y no solo en la Amazonía de Ecuador, también está en Brasil, Perú, Colombia, las mismas situaciones están sucediendo en los territorios indígenas. Los líderes son perseguidos, son encarcelados, son perseguidos políticos. Anteayer noche, nuestro representante máximo, Leonidas Issa, fue preso político, ilegalmente le detuvieron. Entonces todo el pueblo indígena de Ecuador tuvo que movilizar para que le dejen. Ayer noche también salió él. Entonces, ¿qué vemos? Cuando hay un líder indígena que sale a decir ya basta, que paren, no queremos más contaminaciones, no, somos defensores de nuestros territorios, somos perseguidos políticos. No hay una garantía para los luchadores, defensores de la selva. Es muy crítico lo que está sucediendo en nuestros territorios. Por eso pedimos apoyo a los líderes mundiales que tienen que ver esta situación en nuestros territorios. Es duro lo que está pasando en Ecuador. Nosotros estamos luchando por un territorio limpio. Queremos un territorio que mañana tenga especies que sigan viviendo. Queremos que nuestros hijos sigan teniendo territorio, agua limpia, tengan animales. Pero esta lucha no es solo de pueblos indígenas. Tenemos que hacer una lucha conjunta de todos, de todas las personas a nivel mundial, para unir y empezar a luchar, empezar a salvar la Amazonía, porque no es solo nuestro trabajo. Nosotros estamos luchando, pero no es solo para nosotros, es a nivel mundial. La Amazonía sirve a todos. Ahora vemos el cambio climático que está afectando duro en otros países, que estos países han hecho tanto daño, los países desarrollados, pero ellos tienen que recompensar a la Amazonía, a los pueblos indígenas que estamos luchando y cuidando nuestros territorios. Entonces hago un llamado a nivel mundial que tienen que empezar la lucha conjunta con todos, con todos. No, aquí no tienen que haber ideologías, ni raza, ni nada. Aquí todos tenemos que hacer fuerza para poder salvar la Amazonía. Ahora es la lucha. Hoy tenemos que empezar la lucha conjuntamente con todos, porque si esperamos hasta 2050, como muchos acuerdos han llegado, la selva va a desaparecer. La selva está ya en un punto de no retorno, estamos en un colapso ahorita. Entonces, la lucha tiene que ser hoy. Hoy es la lucha. Por eso estamos muchos pueblos aquí concentrados luchando para salvar la Amazonía. Entonces nosotros estamos aquí haciendo nuestra vocería, haciendo nuestra voz que se escuche. No queremos más muerte porque ya a nombre de nuestras luchas también para salvar la Amazonía, muchos líderes han muerto. Mucha gente indígena que ha llegado a las comunidades han tenido enfrentamientos con policías, han muerto. El gobierno lo único que hace, tenemos presión y luego nos ataca para para poder ingresar a nuestros territorios. Ya no más, nosotros solo queremos tener un territorio limpio. Esta es nuestra lucha, esto es nuestra casa. La selva es nuestro hogar, la selva es nuestra farmacia, la selva nos da de comer. Para nosotros la selva es nuestro hogar, es un refugio donde que están nuestros abuelos. Los árboles son los espíritus de nuestra casa. No vamos a permitir que sigan destruyendo más la selva. Entonces estamos aquí haciendo vocería a las mujeres que han venido de distintas comunidades con hijos. Y aquí estamos todas las mujeres indígenas conjuntamente reunidas, hablando, luchando para que nuestros hijos futuros, que sean ellos los que sean representantes y sigan luchando por nuestros territorios. Porque si no hacemos nosotros, nadie nos va a dar luchando por nuestros territorios. Entonces, también a ustedes les invito a que hagan vocería en nombre de la Amazonía. Salvemos conjuntamente toda la Amazonía. Entonces, de mi parte, este paro ha sido duro. Estos días, 2 días de paro, ha habido muertes también. Estamos luchando por nuestros derechos también por Ecuador, que es un país que estamos viviendo momentos muy críticos con el presidente Guillermo Lasso, porque él está creando nuevos decretos y también está haciendo muy duro la vida en Ecuador para nuestros más compañeros que están viviendo en las ciudades, que viven en la sierra, los compañeros. Entonces estamos pidiendo precios justos de nuestros cultivos. No somos valorados. Entonces, las nuevas leyes que sacan nos oprimen a los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, por eso estamos aquí también luchando por la Amazonía, luchando por la sierra, luchando por la costa. Todos estamos aquí unidos, luchando, haciendo vocería, conjuntamente uniendo fuerzas para seguir adelante. La Amazonía es vida para nosotros. La Amazonía no puede terminar ahora. Hoy tenemos que empezar a luchar para que nuestras futuras generaciones puedan encontrar también vida en nuestros territorios. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Nemo. Thank you for sharing those words. And again, if you have any questions for Nemo, about anything that she just said, then please put those in the Q&A box. I will now move on to Pendle, who will be talking about the Amazon exclusion campaign.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Pendle Marshall Hallmark. I'm a climate finance campaigner at Amazon Watch. I am just going to follow up on some of the things that Nemo just shared with everyone about the context in Ecuador right now. As she mentioned, she's currently at a strike. People all over Ecuador are rising up as the streets and the oil fields have become militarized, and there's confrontations happening with police. As we speak, people have been hurt and killed in these conflicts. And essentially, this is all stemming from the impact that fossil fuel and oil drilling specifically has had on the country in Ecuador. But as Nemo mentioned, oil drilling has negative impacts, not just in Ecuador, but all over the Amazon, all over Latin America. We've seen the way that it hurts communities by damaging their water supplies, hurting local flora and fauna, polluting the area, cutting roads into prime forests, threatening the autonomy of communities that have chosen to live in voluntary isolation, threatening the health of women and families and communities. So oil drilling is terrible, no matter where it happens. And Amazon Watch has been working for the last year and a half, not longer, on a campaign, the Amazon Exclusion Campaign, alongside partners at Stand.Earth. And this is essentially a campaign that has sprung out of Indigenous demands to end financing for any kind of extraction activity in the Amazon, including oil and gas drilling. So just to kind of give a little bit of context about this campaign, it actually sprang out of a set of demands that were approved in a motion passed at the IUCN in 2021, last year, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. And so as part of this motion to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025, there were a series of demands made, and one of them was that any kind of financial institution end financing for extractive activities in the Amazon. So this motion, combined with recent international reports from climate scientists like the IEA report and the IPCC report, which have both shown that we need to end fossil fuel expansion immediately if we're going to have any chance of reaching the Paris Climate Agreement goal of limiting global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. These reports are creating a climate that's put a lot of pressure on banks and financial institutions to shift their funding out of fossil fuels. So the Amazon Exclusion Campaign is calling on banks to end financing and investments in any kind of oil and gas activity, excuse me, in the Amazon immediately. And I can go into more specifically what our demands of this campaign are, but I wanted to kind of give a little bit of context here, right? We're seeing catastrophic oil spills, burst pipelines happening all over the Amazon. And we're seeing resistance from Indigenous communities, just like the front line that Nemo is literally standing on right now. This is happening all over the Amazon, not just in Ecuador. And so there's a really risky environment that's being created for potential financiers. And we've been working to be in communication with banks to really let them know about all the risks that are inherent to oil and gas drilling. And just last summer, we came out with a report that really highlighted all of these risks. And there are 6 in particular that we've named that are hand in hand with oil and gas drilling in the Amazon specifically. And those are deforestation, biodiversity loss, indigenous rights violations, pollution, corruption, and of course, climate dysregulation. And so we've seen time and time again that any kind of investment in oil and gas in the Amazon is inherently tied to these kinds of risks that pose major reputational problems for banks, as well as, of course, the risk of stranded assets. And I know it's kind of ugly to talk about stranded assets in the context of human rights, but that's often the language that banks need to hear in order to actually adopt policies that limit their involvement in the Amazon. And so we've seen actually some progress on this campaign. And some of the banks that we've been in communication with have started adopting, taking incremental steps to limit their exposure to Amazon oil and gas. And when I say limit exposure, I mean to limit the amount of financing that they're providing. For example, Societe Generale recently committed to exclude oil from the Ecuadorian Amazon, traded from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and they've labeled hydrocarbons from the region as unconventional, which restricts the amount of financing that they can provide. And they've named the importance of biodiversity, of protecting biodiversity in their decision to make that commitment. I believe it's an Italian bank, Intesa, has also expanded its definition of unconventional oil and gas. And several other banks have taken steps to restrict financing for the trade of Ecuadorian oil. And Ecuador is the largest exporter of oil from the Amazon. The port of Esmeraldas is a port in Ecuador that ships out to the rest of the world. And so the vast majority of oil that's produced from the Amazon comes out of that port. And so we've seen commitments from ING, from Natixis, from Credit Suisse, from a number of other banks to no longer finance the trade of that oil, but that doesn't go far enough, right? We need to see more banks actually committing to no longer finance or invest in the expansion of any oil or gas activities. So not just oil trade, but drilling, exploration, transport. These things are all key parts of the oil and gas trade and industry. And so we've in light of all of this, we have seen one bank that's taken the first step towards that's actually adopted a kind of Amazon exclusion, and that's BNP Paribas. We've been speaking with them for quite a long time, and at least a year. And they recently came out with a commitment to no longer finance oil and gas companies operating in specific areas of the Amazon. And I won't get into the details and the nitty-gritty of their commitment, but just will highlight that this is the first time that any major bank has actually come out and tried to make an exclusion policy based on a geographical area. And there are many problems with the BNP policy, namely that they have yet to release a clear timeline for when they will exclude companies and how much time they'll give companies before they will actually cut off financing to companies that are operating in the region. But they've expressed that they are moving in that direction. So we're seeing that banks, and of course we've seen this with the conflict in Ukraine, right? Banks are capable of excluding financing for oil and gas overnight, really, if there's enough public pressure on them to do so. And so we have been working in coalition with allies across North America and Europe to put pressure on banks so that they will actually adopt policies that exclude oil and gas. And not just in the Amazon, but everywhere. It's as was mentioned earlier, we need to end oil and gas expansion everywhere if we're going to have any hope of reaching the Paris Climate Agreement goals. So, and even that, I think there was a recent study that just came out. Forgive me, I don't have the link on me, but that just showed that current oil and gas, existing oil and gas fields, as they stand, let alone any sort of oil and gas expansion that's planned, is enough to exceed the warming limit that was outlined in the Paris agreements. So this is really an emergency, and we've called on banks, as I said, to do three items. And the demands of the Amazon exclusion are to no longer finance or invest in the expansion of any oil or gas activities in the Amazon basin, which is the hydrographic area, any area in the Amazon that ties into, that's connected to the Amazon River. A commitment to end by 2025 financing for any and all companies currently engaged in oil activities in the Amazon biome for the purposes of facilitating the responsible wind down of operations, right? So one is no longer invest in expansion, and one is to cut financing for existing oil and gas. And then finally, a lot of banks, and this requires a little bit of explanation, but a lot of banks have special products that they use, that they offer, that sort of enable them to shirk responsibility for the impacts that their money has on the ground. And so these include letters of credit or revolving credit facilities, loans, bonds, shareholdings as well. And so we've called on banks to exit all of these products for any and all oil and gas activities originating in the Amazon basin by the end of this year. And as I said, we've seen these preliminary steps taken, but have not seen any bank come out with a commitment as clear as those that we've set out in our demands as of yet. And I'll just close by saying that this is possible. We know that this kind of commitment is possible because we've seen banks exclude financing for oil drilling in the Arctic. So there's already a precedent set for excluding oil and gas drilling in specific geographic areas that have high biodiversity and cultural relevance and value and significance. And so we're making the same case for the Amazon. And as Nemo said earlier, you know, land defenders in the Amazon the Amazon is the most dangerous place in the world right now to be a land defender. More people are killed defending land and natural resources, indigenous territories in the Amazon than anywhere else on the planet. And this is because it's an extremely valuable place. There's a lot of abundant natural resources there. And so people like Nemo, like the other indigenous leaders that we work with, are risking a huge amount when they come out and stand up for their right to clean air and water and autonomy. And so I just want to close by making that connection for people that when we call on the world's largest banks that are mostly European and US banks, we're trying to end a cycle of colonial violence, really. And so this is the way that we're going to do it. We need to end financing for oil and gas everywhere. And I will end there. There's a lot more that I could say. I had other notes, but I will pass the mic on. So thank you very much for the time.
Thanks so much, Pendle. Thank you for sharing that with us. And now on to Ilan to talk about 350 campaigns in Latin America.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the great presentations. First of all, I want to send our solidarity to the people in Ecuador. It's really bad and sad what's happening on the street, the protests, people being arrested, human rights not being respected. So sending all the solidarity to the people and our friends in Ecuador. And yeah, it's very sad to see what's happening in many countries of Latin America. Well, I will share my screen. Basically, two different campaigns that receive in the
Ilan, your
Amazon,
audio
and
has
the
gone a
other
bit
is
broken.
in Argentina, in a region called after hopefully achieve the Brazilian Amazon. He's trying to hold Zoom like in his mobile. Hopefully he'll be able to and also we have a video from chief in Argentina.
Ilan,
Brazilian Amazon, actually the state of Amazonas, and from Argentina.
Ilan, your sound isn't working. I'm not sure if you can hear. Ilan? Your sound isn't working. No, maybe try without headphones this time. No, I still can't hear you.
Maybe if he leaves Zoom and then comes back again.
Yeah. Is there any way you could send me the link for the video and then I can play that whilst we're waiting? Maybe that would work. Great, thank you. Okay, so whilst we're trying to sort that out, I am going to play a video from Jorge Nawal at the climate camp. So hopefully this will work. We'll just give that a go. Okay, so Vaughn, if you could just give me a thumbs up if it's working, that'd be great.
Yes, it works. There's no sound yet though.
Is the sound working?
No, the sound is not working. Do you hear it?
Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay.
Hopefully this will work.
Contra lo que
Yes,
se denomina
yes,
el
it
fracking,
works.
desde el momento que la
Great,
empresa
I'll start that again.
Bueno, mi nombre es Jorge Nahuel, yo soy lonco de la Confederación Mapuche de Neuquén, que es la organización que agrupa a todas las comunidades afectadas por la formación Vaca Muerta. Nosotros llevamos adelante una lucha contra lo que se denomina el fracking, desde el momento en que pisó tierra aquí la empresa Chevron, una de las empresas más desprestigiadas del continente, que fue la seleccionada para venir aquí a explotar territorio mapuche. Las consecuencias que hemos sufrido a partir del momento en que se instala el fracking son de de carácter, algunos de ellos de carácter irreversible, porque el daño que se ha generado sobre el aire, sobre el suelo, sobre el agua, es algo que no se puede calcular porque incluso no se ha logrado encontrar soluciones para muchos de esos daños. Pero la contaminación y el daño ambiental no está previsto dentro de las inversiones de la industria porque es uno de los aspectos más descuidados, todo lo que tiene que ver con la salud y el ambiente. Nosotros acabamos de llevar adelante una denuncia penal contra los grupos empresariales, y fundamentalmente contra los responsables de los estados que no generan ningún tipo de control sobre esta industria, a raíz de lo que se denomina basura petrolera. Todo un conjunto de desechos tóxicos que hoy no tienen tratamiento porque no hay inversión, porque no hay tecnología, pero fundamentalmente porque no hay ningún interés en poder encontrarle una solución a este enorme daño hacia la salud y hacia el aire, el ambiente, no solo de las comunidades mapuches, sino de toda la población de Neuquén. Nosotros creemos que hay una actitud cómplice, una actitud protectora de parte de la justicia de Neuquén y incluso de la propia justicia federal, porque ellos no han sabido sancionar adecuadamente según la denuncia que nosotros le hemos formulado. Hemos formulado denuncias a la industria, a sus responsables y a los responsables políticos, y encontramos una actitud de absoluto encubrimiento de parte de la justicia. Eso hace todavía mucho más desigual la lucha contra esta industria y es necesario, urgente, tomar medidas contra eso. Una de las medidas más adecuadas, una de las medidas más urgentes que se debería tomar contra esta industria tan nociva es justamente dejar de financiar proyectos. A nosotros nos parece que es una actitud, un doble discurso moral que realizan los países del primer mundo cuando prohíben esta industria en sus respectivos países, sin embargo siguen financiando, siguen de alguna manera brindándole toda la cobertura económica para que esta explotación no pare. Y si esta explotación no para, ya lo dicen los propios científicos del mundo Winca, el fracking es uno de los principales responsables del cambio climático global. Por lo tanto, las consecuencias las estamos padeciendo a nivel planetario. Es una consecuencia que trasciende al mundo mapuche, es una consecuencia que trasciende a la población de la Patagonia Argentina y se convierte en un verdadero flagelo para la humanidad. Y por eso es inconcebible que aún con todas estas condiciones que denunciamos permanentemente y que la propia ciencia occidental expresa, que todavía se sigan financiando estos emprendimientos de muerte. Nosotros necesitamos llamar la atención, necesitamos hacer un llamamiento hacia esos grupos económicos que destinan importantes recursos para sostener esta industria, para que se sumen a nuestra campaña para detener esta actividad criminal. Nosotros necesitamos desarrollar nuestra vida, nuestros planes de vida en territorios libres, en territorios sanos. Y eso no es posible mientras se siga profundizando este tipo de industria. Y vuelvo a repetir, es algo que no va a generar impacto sobre la vida del pueblo mapuche ni sobre la vida de la población de la Patagonia Argentina, sino que el impacto va a ser de carácter planetario y por eso hay que hacer algo para detenerlo.
Okay. I would like to thank Jorge in his absence. And yeah, we'll go back to Ilan in the hopes that his audio might be working this time.
Let's see.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, go for it.
Okay, well, sorry about that, but you had the pleasure of hearing Jorge, I think way better than hearing myself. So yeah, I will then share again my screen with you. Oops, you're seeing my Slack. And now, yes. So I will start speaking about the Argentinian case since we were all able to hear Jorge now. So Jorge was speaking really about fracking in Argentina, and fracking in Argentina is happening in a region called Vaca Muerta, right? You can see in the map is this region.
Ilan, we don't see
Sorry?
the presentation yet.
Oh no.
It's still your other screen.
Okay. Let's go again. What about now?
Yes.
Okay. So I will start speaking about the case in Argentina. We just heard Jorge speaking about the situation of the Mapuches, what's happening with them in Argentina. And basically, Jorge lives in an area called the Vaca Muerta Formation. It is a geological formation in this part of Argentina, and it's really a very big formation. It has the size of Belgium, for example, so it's a very big area, and it's considered to have the second highest shale gas reserves in the world and the fourth oil reserves. So it's really an area that is generating a lot of interest from the international markets, banks, funds, fossil fuel companies, and all of that. Fracking in Argentina started around 2010, about more than 10 years ago. And Argentina didn't have the technology, the expertise, or the money to do fracking. So what happened is that YPF, the state-owned company in Argentina, made a partnership with the American company called Chevron. You saw Jorge speaking about Chevron, and that's when fracking started in Argentina. So some of the impacts in small farmers, there's fracking towers really close to areas where people are planting apple trees, for example, displacement of indigenous communities. We just heard Jorge speaking. There's several earthquakes in many areas of the provinces where they're doing fracking. People wake up in the middle of the night with the house shaking. We can see fractures in the houses. People are getting sick. There's no place to put the toxic waste and radioactive waste from fracking. Social problems like violence, workers invading towns. Several oil spills have been happening since fracking started in Argentina. Several methane leaks, even explosions, and also including some sad death reports from workers of the industry, as well as people that got contaminated. So here is a list of some of the banks in Europe, Asia, and US that are supporting fracking in Argentina. This is just some of the banks. It's really a majority of the bank you can think should be involved in fracking in Argentina in any form. So there's really a lot of international money coming to Argentina, as well as international oil and gas companies. So just to list a few of them, again, there's way more than these companies, but they are all there in Argentina doing fracking, supporting with expertise, with technique, with know-how, with workers. For example, when there's a very big fire or explosion that happened in Argentina, there are employees from the US or from Europe that need to go there to extinguish the fire. It's really a lot of exchange that they are doing. And here is a picture that we took in one field trip to Vaca Muerta. You can see the fracking tower here, and very close to the fracking tower, the apple trees. So farmers are losing markets. People are afraid to buy apples from this area in Argentina, the risk of being contaminated. Here is one image from Greenpeace Argentina showing one of the many spills that happened in this region of Argentina, that it's part of it is in the Argentinian Patagonia. And here is one image of one of the latest protests from the Mapuches in front of one of the headquarters of the state-owned Argentinian fossil fuel company. They were protesting against a new gas pipeline that's planned to be being built in Argentina this year. So this is about fracking in Argentina. And now I will go back to the Brazilian Amazon as I was speaking. So the Brazilian Amazon does not have a lot of history of oil and gas exploration, especially if we compare to Ecuador, for example, or to Peru, where this exploration, unfortunately, is way more advanced. So in the Brazilian Amazon, they tried to explore oil and gas many years ago. Indigenous people were able to stop. They came back in about 2012, 2013. The Russian company Rosneft bought some areas, but until today they were not able to extract oil and gas there. They have been avoiding the extraction, asking for more time to explore the area to see if there is oil and gas there. And most recently, after more than 10 years without any blocks being auctioned in the Brazilian Amazon, a company called Eneva bought 3 big blocks in 2020. So here we have the map of the Brazilian Amazon. This is the state of Amazonas, a really big state, the size of several countries. So it's a very big area. And the areas in yellow and red are all blocks that are available to be purchased by fossil fuel companies in next fossil fuel auctions. And what has been purchased so far is really these 3 blocks. Fortunately, from more than 80 blocks, so far only 3 were purchased. And this is thanks to a lot of pressure coming from many organizations, indigenous people. So far, we've been able to avoid some of the blocks of being auctioned. But unfortunately, some of them were bought. These are 3 of them. You can see these areas in brown are indigenous lands. These areas in pink are conservation units with a lot of biodiversity. This land here is the land of Jonas Moura, the chief that hopefully will be able to speak with us. This is his land, so it's very close to the area, and he's already suffering some impacts of the exploration, of the research. He's been telling us a lot of things. We also visit his land, and also I'm going to show this map. Basically, this one that I'm showing is this area here, and this area is in the borders of Peru and Colombia. It is an area still under study, but the National Gas Oil of Brazil, they believe that this is one of the areas with the highest reserves of oil and gas. So it's been under study, and they have been really trying to auction this in the next years. We have presidential elections in Brazil this October, so it's very uncertain what can happen. But so far, this has been under study. We've been able to avoid these areas being auctioned because this area here, it has the highest density of uncontacted indigenous people in the world. This is the area that maybe some of you are hearing about, the British journalists and the indigenous Bruno and Dom that are missing in Brazil. This is the area where they were working, and it's a very dangerous area with a lot of threats. Oil and gas is another one. So far we've been able to avoid oil and gas there, but there are several other things happening, unfortunately. So this is really a sum of the situation. And so far we've been able to work against some of the banks that are involved in the Brazilian Amazon, including BTG Pactual, Cambuí Funds, and the Brazilian Development Bank, the BNDES. We have been working with the chief Jonas Moura. Last year, we did an action in front of the office of the bank. We delivered a petition for the bank's executive. These are some of the banks that are doing a lot of ESG, speaking that are very green banks and a lot of things. So we are trying to confront this narrative and ask them to stop investing in oil and gas in the Brazilian Amazon. And the same we have been doing for fracking in Argentina. Of course, there are way more banks. So we have been figuring out which are some of the banks that we can try to put some pressure. And that's a bit of what I wanted to let you know today. And just the end here, I put 3 links more where people can learn more. Maybe I can put them in the chat. And yeah, and there's options for people to take action as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I will check my WhatsApp. Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's going to be hard for us to listen. The Chief Moura has been trying to download the Zoom app, but he's not been able to get it with a very low connection. So yeah, back to you, Natasha.
Thanks. It could also be worth messaging him to try and tap to join by phone. But if not, maybe we can do some questions, and then if you have anything to add that you know about his situation, then maybe you can add those at the end. But yeah, thank you everyone also for bearing with with us with the technical issues. Zoom is obviously very difficult, especially with connection issues and especially across time zones. So we'll go on to some questions now. So perhaps we'll start with the one in the chat because the questioner said that they might have to leave. So if it's all right for Pendle to take this one. So the question is about older existing oil and gas projects which are in disrepair. For example, if there is an old pipeline or facility which poses a public safety hazard and needs financing to fix, how would the exclusion policy address those situations?
Yeah, so we've thought about this issue before in conversations with banks, and as we're sort of thinking about how we wanted to build out the demands for this campaign. And a lot of countries actually have separate facilities, separate sort of entities for the cleanup and repair of pipelines and the extraction and production of oil. And so our sort of go-to demand in that instance is that countries establish, if they don't already have one, and I know Ecuador does have one, a government agency that's responsible for repairing and cleaning oil pipelines or oil spills. And that way, financing that goes to recovery and repair does not get looped in with financing for expansion of oil and gas. But that is a major pitfall and a concern that a lot of climate activists have in these kinds of finance campaigns. Is we really want to be clear that we're not advocating for, we don't want to be in a situation where we need to finance an oil company in order to repair harms that an oil company has perpetrated. So I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but I hope it does. Feel free to chime into the chat if you have a follow-up there.
Thanks, Pendle. And yeah, Catherine, feel free to follow up on that if you want. And as we said in the chat, we'll also get in touch with the email in case you have any further questions. So one for Micah now. What are the contributing factors for coal policies being a bit stronger than policies around gas and oil?
Yeah, thanks. I guess it's a good question. I think mainly here it's sort of the amount of time that campaigners have already spent sort of focusing on this. So there's just been campaigning around stopping bank financing for coal for a longer time. And I think especially, for example, in the case of French financial institutions, there's been some really big successes in pushing them to adopt a lot stronger policies. Maybe also what can play a role in the case of, for example, Europe, is that our power grids have moved away from coal towards gas a lot, and also towards renewables. So in a lot of European countries, like for the national economy, it's not so difficult to move away from coal. And I guess that also could be an explanation why we see that Chinese banks still have higher levels of financing for the coal industry. And I think also what we see here a lot is that this narrative around gas being a bridge fuel is something that sort of makes it a bit harder to campaign on this. So of course, a lot of banks also repeat this narrative that we will need gas for the foreseeable future, so we cannot stop financing it for the moment, which of course is something that we disagree with, but it's something that you hear also from policymakers. So I guess the debate around coal has been settled, right? It's clear that we have to phase out coal in 2030 in OECD countries already, and the debate around oil and gas is a bit newer, so there's still a bit more to fight there.
Great, thank you for that response. There is a question for Nemo, but she seems to have dropped off the call. So we can always follow up if she has any thoughts she particularly wants to share. We will be doing follow-up email, so yeah, we can do that. A last question is, what can groups and organizations in the US do to support Indigenous groups of the Amazon? So I think maybe I'll throw that over to Ilan and Pendle.
I'm happy to take a stab at it, and then Ilan, if you want to answer, go for it. Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to support Indigenous groups in the Amazon. One way is to give them money directly. Amazon Watch has a Defend the Defenders fund. That's basically a regranting fund that we have that goes out to supporting Indigenous communities on the front lines of climate fights. We've distributed, I'm not going to give an exact figure, but a lot of money to people who need urgent supplies, to pay for healthcare in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, to pay to get people to advocacy meetings, to pay for protests. There's a lot of different ways that you can support Indigenous frontline fights to protect the Amazon. So I encourage folks to check out AmazonWatch.org and check out our Amazon Defenders Fund. You can also find out more information about the Amazon exclusion policy that I was talking about earlier on our website. And I'll leave it at that for now. I'll pass to you, Ilan.
Thanks, Pendle. I think this is all great, and I agree with all of these. These are really great options. Well, I can also suggest for folks' interest to check as well 350.org website. We always have also links to donate for frontline communities. Also, you can also check our social media. We're always redirecting people to reliable Indigenous organizations. So I think donating money is really one of the main ones, but also sharing reliable information in your social media, sharing with people. Of course, you need to check well what sort of information we are sharing, of course, to avoid fake news. Sometimes there's a lot of sensitive information, so always double check what you're sharing about Indigenous people. And also, I will just put a small link here in the chat as well. This was a digital campaign that we did with some Indigenous people to put some pressure in the banks and the fossil fuel company that are behind the fossil fuel projects in the Brazilian Amazon. So you can send a Twitter message, you can send an email to CEOs of the banks, of the executives, and put some pressure. I think these are all things that you could do. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. And as I said before, we'll be sending a follow-up email, both with the recording of this and all the links that everyone's just mentioned, and probably a few more. Ilan, I'm guessing you didn't manage to sort the situation. Okay, that's a real shame, but perhaps we can include in that email some words. And yeah, thank you for trying as well. So I'll just also answer the final question that Pendle answered live, but I'll read it out for anyone who didn't spot that. So there was a question that asked Pendle to repeat the 6 risks that she referred to. So just to reinforce for everyone, they're deforestation, biodiversity loss, Indigenous rights violations, pollution, corruption, and the exacerbation of climate dysregulation. And you can read a report. The link is in the Q&A box in the answered section. So that's it from our speakers and questions. Thank you so much to everyone for attending, and a huge thank you to our speakers, Micah, Nemo, Pendle, Ilan, Jonas, and Jorge, who will maybe share some words with us afterwards. If you have any additional questions, you can email me directly at natasha@banktrack.org, which someone can now put in the chat if that's all right. And feel free to get in touch with me directly regarding anything to do with the webinar, and I can always pass you on to the relevant person. So Von's also going to put a link to the report in the chat just now so that you can read it for yourselves. And yeah, as I've said a few times, we'll be sending a follow-up email, so keep an eye on your inboxes for that. Thank you once more, and I hope everyone has a lovely day, and yeah, look forward to hearing from those of you who want to get in touch with us. So thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I also wanted to just add that if you're interested in learning more about what's happening in Ecuador, we have an urgent press release that we're putting on our website right now. I don't think it's quite been published, but I can see my colleagues working on it in this moment. So there'll be more information about the violence that Nema was referring to if you want to learn more. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thanks, Theo and Anders. Thank you.
Bye. Okay, it's only panelists now.
Yeah, I removed everyone.
Okay.
Are we still recording or is it?
Oh yeah, I'll stop the recording.